This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. In this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, I take a deep dive into the first Department of Financial Services, that's State of New York, enforcement action around cybersecurity involving First American Title Company. In this deep dive, I am joined by John Arnold, Chief Innovation Officer at K2 Intelligence Fin, and Surjit Mahant, Managing Director at K2 Intelligence Fin, Financial Crimes and Risk Compliance Practice. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and today I'm extraordinarily pleased to have with me John Fons. I've known John for quite some time, and I wanted to visit with him about some of the his thoughts, on what makes a good CECO, what makes a good compliance program, and how the board of directors works into all of that. So, John, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, thanks, Tom. I'm very happy to be here. Hope that I can add some color to some of the things that go into making a good chief compliance officer and a good relationship with the board.
John, I was wondering if you could detail for our listeners a little bit about your professional background.
I started in the legal profession in in-house counsel way back in 1984, and have worked for a variety of large and small publicly traded companies. I've been a general counsel for about 15 years, and I joined a manufacturer in the Midwest that was a publicly traded company that had operations in 18 countries, 14,000 employees, and I created their compliance and ethics program from scratch, and have been doing that for now about 12 years or so. I've
been in this field since about 2007, and the company I worked for at the time had gone through an FCPA investigation and had sustained a violation, and I was part of the new executive leadership team that came in to implement the DOJ solution, or rather write a solution, which was a new compliance program. But one of the things the DOJ insisted upon was that the board of directors had to have a compliance committee. At that point in my legal and professional career, I had not heard of that. And that's one of the things I've heard you advocate throughout the years is a board having a compliance committee, or I guess the way I've heard you phrase it is a compliance function needs to report into a board committee separate from audit. And I was wondering if you might be able to expand on that a little bit.
I mean, the audit committee is a great committee to have for publicly traded company, and I would assume for the privately held companies as well. But their focus is primarily on financial risk. You know, whether or not the financial statements are properly stated and that they can report accurately the financials to their shareholders. And, over the years, compliance was added into that, but it's always been a sort of a appendix to the rest of the operations of the audit committee. And, back during the days of Sarbanes-Oxley's introduction, committees were required to have financial experts, and that's great, but that does little for the compliance world. Compliance is primarily, or at least at a minimum, a risk function. And it's really an operational risk function more than a financial risk function. Obviously, if you're paying fines to the DOJ or the SEC for FCPA violations or for sanctions violations, there's a financial component to that, but it's primarily a operational risk, and so that's really not the forte of the audit committee. And so having a risk committee or a compliance committee would put the correct amount of focus on what I think is one of the chief risks that any organization faces, particularly if they're doing business outside of the United States and doing business through third parties in terms of distributors and representatives. And with the extended supply chains today, people are buying things from all over the world. So these are risks that the Audit Committee just really isn't poised to take on.
John, if I could flip that thought with my next question, which is, what would you suggest, or how would you suggest a compliance committee on the board oversee a CCO, a CECO, or a compliance function? How do you see the the compliance committee's role, and how would they execute that role?
Well, I think the standard should be that they need to look at compliance as a strategic function of the organization. And so, again, it should not be something that is an afterthought or something that's a check-the-box kind of approach. They need to look at it from a strategic standpoint. And I think, in today's world where you've got companies who are looking to do more than just simply shareholder value, but they're looking for stakeholder value, that's an important aspect of it. So they're looking beyond just the bare financials. And, they need to partner with, in fact, they probably ought to be selecting the chief compliance officer, because that person is going to be their eyes and ears in the organization. I mean, in a way, it's similar to internal audit, but it's a different perspective. Internal audit's looking at whether or not the controls are effective in operating, and compliance is looking to build the controls. So they need to have that direct relationship with the chief compliance officer. And the aspects that you look at from the perspective of the DOJ, they recently updated their guidance on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. They talked about the need for the board to have access to expertise. And while that's good, in fact, essential, that presumes that it's not going to be somebody on the board. The need for financial expertise on the board is the same kind of thing that boards need to have compliance expertise. Compliance is a specialized field. It's a growing field. And frankly, most board members only have a very small understanding of what compliance is or should be doing. So, having somebody on the board, and whether it's a risk committee or a compliance committee, whatever you call it, you're going to need to have somebody who has some real understanding of compliance. So you need, I believe, to have a compliance expert on the board. And compliance can be in a difficult situation. You are a member of management, but you also really should be reporting directly to the board in their capacity as representatives of the shareholders. And, there's talk about you have to have private meetings with the audit committee or with the risk committee or compliance committee. But that puts the auditors the board members in a very difficult situation, because if there's conversations within that private meeting that haven't been surfaced with the CEO or the general counsel or the CFO, they're going to have to be surfaced with them. And then the chief compliance officer is in a difficult spot. Another of the aspects that the Department of Justice's updated guidance talked about is the need to have adequate resources. And, that's quite frankly preaching to the choir, because it's going to be the chief compliance officers that are reading that guidance, and they, I think everybody would agree that they're uniformly nodding their head yes, that we need adequate resources. And yet, to get those resources, you're going into the general counsel or into the the chief financial officer or into the CEO and having those discussions. And if they say, this is what we're going to give you, in the end, you're going to have to accept what they say. And that puts the chief compliance officer in a tough spot because, proper question from the board to the chief compliance officer is, do you have the adequate resources to do, an effective program? And if you're asked that in front of the CEO or the CFO or general counsel, how do you answer that question? Because if you say, I do, well, then you are going to have whatever you have. And if you say you don't, you've now disagreed with the CEO, GC, and CFO. And if you try to sort of waffle on it, a sharp board member is going to say, tell us, do you have the adequate resources? And so it's a real dilemma for the chief compliance officers, and so they need to have the board committee setting that level of resources in conjunction with obviously the chief compliance officer.
John, let me change the focus just a little bit to the CECO or the CCO and sort of some of the structural protections a CCO can have. I've heard you articulate that you believe a CECO needs a written contract with a severance clause in there. This perhaps is not unusual for a CEO, a CFO, but many CECOs may not have one. Why do you think that's so critical?
Yeah, I mean, for some of what we just talked about, which is, if you are at risk of getting sideways with the CEO or the CFO or the general counsel, and they have the ability to terminate you, you are not going to have that independence that is necessary. The Institute of Internal Auditors just came out with their revised 3 lines model, and they talked about independence for the internal audit function. I think they got a little bit off on the compliance function also needs to have that level of independence, and I think that's what the Department of Justice in that revised guidance is talking about. That they're looking for, that having sufficient autonomy. The DOJ is looking for the chief compliance officer to really have a robust program that is not getting filtered or influenced by other managers or other members of senior management, and that you're always at risk if you are, subject to the employment at will aspects. And I think really, again, this is a situation where the board needs to have direct involvement. I think historically, the board has looked to management and says, say, do you have the kind of programs you think you need? And they, talk to the CECO or the CCO, and they give them their opinion. But can they really give them their full, unbridled opinion? The chief compliance officer can get themselves into situations such as when there are internal investigations that may or may not involve management, or particularly senior management, and that's a very challenging situation. And they are looking to the chief compliance officer to give them the unvarnished truth. And again, you're sitting in an audit committee meeting or a board meeting with the CEO and the CFO sitting there, general counsel sitting there, and you may not have the same opinion that they have. And expressing that puts that person at a career risk. And so I think having a contract, a written employment contract with the protection of severance guaranteed in there is really where companies need to get to. And I think until that time, you're not going to truly have the autonomy that the DOJ is looking for.
You mentioned that autonomy a couple of times, John. That is in the 2020 update to the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Program. That's something that the Department of Justice has articulated for some time now, at least back to 2017 and perhaps even a little bit earlier, is that something is because the department puts that in a document like the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, does that help a CECO when they need to go in and talk to the board, when they need to go in and talk to senior management about the structure of their role?
It does. There's no question about it. It gives them a basis for stating that they need to have a level of independence. Again, if in the current practices of having the compliance officer report into the Audit Committee, are they actually at the table? They may be giving a report to the general counsel who reports into the Audit Committee. They may be only attending one or two meetings a year. What they say is getting filtered. The CEO or the general counsel is reviewing the report before it goes to the board. So you can argue that it's somewhat sanitized by the time it gets to the board. It certainly is going to express an opinion that is consistent with the opinions of the CEO and the general counsel, and so if the board is looking for that unvarnished truth, they may well not get it because of fear by the chief compliance officer that they can't sidestep the senior management, and so you're not going to get that autonomy unless you have something like an employment agreement that provides you with some protection.
I have one colleague who, for a long period of time, at least 10 years, has advocated that the termination of a CECO should be an 8K event. You take that, I think, a step further in that both the hiring and the termination of a CECO should be an 8K event. I was wondering if you might explain to our audience what an 8K event is and then why you advocate both the hiring and termination should be 8K events.
When there is something that occurs to a publicly traded company that the shareholders would have an interest in that might have a material effect on the price of the securities, the company is obligated to file a filing, an 8K filing, which if you look at it, you've got 10Ks and you've got 10 Qs, the 10K being the annual report, the 10Q being the quarterly report. In between, something occurs that's significant to the shareholders, then it's an 8K. And, the chief compliance officer, really, their real client, if you will, is the shareholders. And, they act through the board, which are the representatives of the shareholders, but, they are looking out for the shareholders. In fact, in a sense, there's the old adage of the canary in the mine. That if the canary gets sick and dies in the mine, the miners all need to be worried that they better get out of the mine because there's the colorless, odorless gas that can kill them in there. And if the compliance officer is suddenly no longer there, then the board, but then really the shareholders should be aware that there's this kind of a change. And when you are hiring somebody into that role, obviously there's a need to have that person be very qualified. They have to have, the background and the track record to demonstrate that they can make an effective program and keep it working. And again, the shareholders should want to know about that because that, I believe, impacts materially on the operations of the company. So, it's going back to this idea that it's a risk function. If the company decided it was going to get rid of insurance on its its properties, and just say, well, we're going to save some money by not buying an insurance policy this year for our property, plant, and equipment. I think the shareholders would be concerned about that. And likewise, if a company decides we're going to go without our chief compliance officer to save some money in the short run, that's something that I think the shareholders would likewise be concerned about and certainly want to know about.
John, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but this has been a fascinating exploration of some topics that I don't think really get enough play in the compliance community. Perhaps they're somewhat esoteric, perhaps they're too technical, but I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me.
Good, Tom. Well, I appreciate the opportunity and hope that added some color to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I'm running a couple of special series I'd like to visit with you about that I hope you'll listen to. The first one is a series on Wirecard and the accounting fraud fallout from that goes out every Wednesday that I'm doing with Mikhail Ryder-Gordon, Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors. The second is this month in September on the Compliance Life, I have Deanna Wangquo, who is a former CCO, and she talks about her journey to the CCO chair and some of her experiences in joining it. Deanna has perhaps the most unique compliance background of anyone I know. She was in QA/QC at NASA before she moved to the company where she became CCO. So it's a great story. I know you'll get a lot out of it. The Compliance Life has become an incredibly popular series, so check it out. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.